With JD Vance questioning Europe and suggesting that we've lost the way in terms of Western values. That'll be the man who doesn't like the cat ladies, by the way. With Donald Trump managing to discuss the future of a country, Ukraine, without them in the room, and talking to a man labelled a war criminal, Vice President Putin. With Nigel Farage saying there's no split in the right in Britain and England particularly, because the Conservative Party, even led by the right-wing Kemi Badenoch, is not right-wing enough to count. There's just a rush in the wrong direction, in the view of Pat and myself. We're asking who will stand up and articulate a proper case for social democracy in Scotland particularly. Those are the headlines. Now for the podcast.
Hi, Johnson. I'm going to stick with this, Riddick. You laughed. Hi, chums, and welcome to this week's Leslie Riddick podcast.
Because I know what's coming here, right?
I know what's coming. Oh, absolutely. Because, yes, folks, you know that what we've done over the past few months is, thanks to the coach, we've been putting up the episodes of the podcast up on YouTube. And it's been going gangbusters. Really, really, really great to see. But what's happened is that there was a decision reached that possibly people who were interested in all the other multifarious things that Leslie does, particularly those in the Nordics who are looking at the films, etc., might not be interested in in-depth lefty chat about Scottish independence and Scottish politics. So we decided to create a new YouTube channel. And we're kind of betwixt and between in setting it up. And we've also got the issue is we've got to tell everybody who listens to us through the usual podcast provider how to access the podcast on YouTube. Whereas paradoxically, the people who actually need to know this will be listening on YouTube. So, but anyway, if any of you are interested and you follow this line of thought in actually getting the podcast on YouTube, you have to go into YouTube and using the symbol @ and you put in @ Leslie Riddick Podcast. And that takes you to YouTube if you want to listen to the podcast on YouTube. We are in the process. Oh, well, I like the collective we there, Leslie. The coach is in the business. Is currently in the business of actually putting a link up on the old Leslie Riddick podcast website to migrate you to the new one. So I'm going to make an apology to everyone who listens to us on YouTube who are currently not listening about the fact that we've got a new
that was
YouTube
the laugh.
channel.
You see completely.
God.
This is like time. I can't get time zones and time difference either like this, But anyway, if anyone who's not listening now, because
they're not listening now, yeah,
because they got scunnered with a YouTube shift and everything, it would like to listen again, then obviously you're not listening. But you could just look for the podcast. I mean, the trouble is the old podcasts are all sitting on the existing YouTube channel called with my name on it. But the new ones are popping up only on the YouTube channel. Yeah. That's Leslie Riddick Podcast. And if you put into a normal search Leslie Riddick Podcast, up comes the old YouTube channel because it's been used more and Google likes it more. Yes. But this will change when the coach does cunning things in the background that he hasn't done yet, we think. So, I mean, this was a pointless public information, because this is like it's as clear as mud, and the people who need to hear it are not listening. So that having been said, hello, everyone.
Yes, but to quote the great Fraser Crane, we are listening because another listener got in touch last week about nuclear energy, and it was a listener from Wales. And I will let you deal with this because it's got lots of pronunciations in it about nuclear energy in Wales, Leslie.
Indeed. And I mean, I wrote a column about this basically with almost every political party, and particularly Labour. And Anna Sarwar demanding that Scotland now completely unnecessarily throw itself behind new nuclear power stations when the future for us is all forms and integration of all forms of renewables so that you get baseload and everything. Anyway, David Thomas emailed, which you can do at hello@leslieriddick.com. And that's hello, not hallow. Anyway, he emailed and said, I enjoyed your discussion nuclear energy. I too am bewildered at the nihilistic enthusiasm of the nuclear lobby, given the obvious problems you enumerated in the podcast. You touched on the Ulfa Nuith scheme in Anglesey. And he said, I had a letter published in the FT about this. It was in response to a nuclear industry spokesperson who likened concerns about the impact on Welsh-speaking communities of the OFA plan to concerns about bats and newts.
Oh, geez.
So Welsh speakers are just blockers now, righty-ho. And he says Wales also has the potential you have repeatedly described in Scotland for renewables. As you point out, the potential for tidal energy in Wales is huge. The rush to nuclear is madness. And just while we're on the mad thing, he says, your podcast makes me feel I am not mad, but everyone else is. So thank you for making me feel sane once a week. Delighted, David. Go on yourself.
Yeah, well, it's always nice to hear that. Again, it used to say it was the X Factors. We are not alone. Was that in the X Factor? Oh, dearie me. Right, and I'm glad to hear it's hello, not hallow, because I did suggest ahoy, ahoy, but nobody was willing to take that one up for the.
But just steady on now, Pat. I mean, you're getting giddy now, after that our nonsense start. God, and it's all grim from here on in, isn't it?
It's all downhill from all in. Yeah, because yes, it's been a hell of a week. We did start to indicate our disgust at the Trump plan for owning Gaza and stepping in and taking over, and the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians. And that's the one thing about Trump. I mean, you're just battered with change after change and disruption after disruption. And the latest is and it's now just taking place in Riyadh, the joint discussions on the future of Ukraine, not featuring any representative from the Ukraine, between the USA and Russia. And it just seems to be, have we moved into, and we'll be talking about JD Vance in Munich, have we moved into pre-war Munich with our discussions taking about foreign countries at a far distance about which we know very little, and Ukraine, as was Poland, is it going to be divvied up on the basis of these two great powers, Russia and the USA, deciding the fate of Ukraine? And there you go, Zelensky. It sucks to be you.
Yeah, it kind of looks like that. And weirdly, and this wouldn't be a normal one for me either, a piece in the Telegraph has really nailed an aspect of this, which is one of their reporters saw a leaked draft contract from the Americans that demands £400 billion worth of rare earth minerals. And if you're listening to this podcast, that should ring a bell, because that's what Greenland has. It's the 8th largest home of rare earth minerals in the world. And that's all the stuff that goes into making mobile phones and the tech bros need for all that, their stuff and electric cars. So that's what, the Americans want from Ukraine. They also want, according to this leaked contract, ports, other infrastructure and oil and gas from Ukraine. And the World Economy editor of the Telegraph has described what he says are the extraordinary proposals as amounting to American economic colonization of Ukraine in legal perpetuity, which would require Ukraine to give up a bigger share of its GDP than the reparations imposed on Germany at Versailles.
Yeah.
I mean, it's jaw-dropping. And I think because people are, rightly focused on who's in the room and who's not in the room, and the incredible snub of kind of the Americans just deciding, on the one hand, that they have nothing particularly to do with Europe. Well, in that case, you'd kind of think logically, butt out. But then they are involved in Europe enough to be the ones to kind of make all the running with Putin, overriding all the kind of, these arrest warrants and international criminal court stuff and all the rest of it. They are involved enough for him to just welly in and take on negotiations that he doesn't want to back up in any way at all. But the thing about this is, meanwhile, back at the fort, it looks like it's another variation. Look at all the things that have happened. Greenland, well, Gaza, real estate possibilities, we discussed that. And you think this is so cynical and unbelievable. It can't possibly be true. And then Ukraine. And that's the Telegraph. They're not exactly the most left-wing publication in the universe, spotting the economic colonization ideas that lie behind that, which, so we'll all be watching to see, as Ukrainians themselves are saying, they want security guarantees in the long term about what would happen. So it's the same with Gaza. The Ukrainian MPs that have been saying, we don't want a ceasefire. We want a permanent solution for this, so that there's no chance of, breaching back in again by the Russians. And they kind of talk about NATO membership, but then you're thinking, well, I mean, if the next little one that Trump pulls out of the hat is that the Americans are actually quitting NATO, which they might well do, they could do, then again you're left with the challenge that the whole of Europe is suddenly left with, which is, our defence spending is nowhere near what it needs to be. And I was watching Scotland Tonight last night, and Hannah Bardell was on, who lost her seat recently. And she made the very good point that the only way you can finance the level of investment in conventional defence is by scrapping Trident.
Yes.
And that became a bit of a talking point, it being the bold Colin Mackay that was chairing it, so that John McClellan, who was a former Scotsman editor and conservative spin something or other, was kind of doing his, it's just completely unthinkable at a time like this. We need the nuclear deterrent and everything. And the thing is, if you're really, really eyeballing this expenditure that would be required to get anywhere near this, it's just, no one is anywhere near the level of spending, except, Estonia and Lithuania, but they're much smaller countries. And I see that there was, the former army chief, Richard Dannett, who's rolled out a lot of the time to kind of make sense of things. He's been saying basically the military is currently so run down, it couldn't spare enough troops to contribute to the 100,000 he thinks are needed just to protect Kyiv. So that when you come to the kind of big talk Keir Starmer's got about potentially putting boots on the ground in Ukraine, what it looks like the army guys are saying is, we haven't got the capacity to do that. So if you're really serious about a total step change and basically Europe taking on European defence, you've got to look again at something like Trident. And you've got to ask yourself an awful lot of questions here, which I suspect nobody is kind of ready to ask.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to unpick there, Leslie. But yeah, that rare earths thing. I mean, of course, Trump has placed these tariffs on China. And who has control over the vast majority of rare earths and the market? Well, lo and behold, it's China. And what Zelensky has said, he's not averse to the US economic colonization, if you like, but he wants embedded within that framework discussions about Ukraine's security future. So we'll see what happens there. And on the Trident basis, I mean, I think it was the audit office. They're well over budget, and the money just isn't there to actually replace the nuclear fleet. I mean, it's a fantasy project that's going to cost so much money. And Starmer, as you said, he's done the usual thing. I mean, I remember the Falkland War. I mean, Thatcher was so unpopular. And it's gone down through history, the minute you're unpopular as on domestic front, let's put on the flak jacket. Not just metaphorically, but literally. Let's put the flak jacket on and beat the drum for war. And boots on the ground, as you said there. And that shift in defence spending, which is going to necessitate significant cuts in non-protected departments. And that's what's coming down the line.
And Hannah's contribution was really memorable from the point that she mentioned the nephew of a cousin, so it was kind of a bit of extended family, who died in either Afghanistan or Iraq because he didn't have the right kit.
Yeah.
And had actually contracted all sorts of horrible illnesses, diseases actually in the process, and was told it was his fault. So, there'll be lots of people listening. You've got to, it's an agony to think of all the freaking wars there've been, and there'll be people listening who've lost folk. And, seriously, you don't have to be a kind of open-toed, sandaled hippie to ask what it was for, because in Iraq and Afghanistan, and then now, these Ukrainians who've lost, so many people and given up so much to just be, like a barter piece between, the best that happens is that you are, to quote the Telegraph, permanently colonized economically by the Americans in exchange for a wobbly commitment by a guy you can't trust that he is going to protect you from essentially a maniac.
Mm-hmm. No,
and that's where we are.
Yeah, he's a despot. I mean, and what we're faced with there is, I mean, you've got the transactional Trump, which is where we're identifying here. It will be about let's what money we can make out of Gaza. How can we get the rare earths out of Greenland? How can we get the rare earths out of Ukraine? And what Trump said about Ukraine, he said, well, the Russians, you see, they've lost so many people and so many soldiers. They're entitled to keep what they've won, and you're thinking to yourself, oh God, it is that handing over because of whatever Trump's up to transactionally, but also because of his admiration for the strong man. And that's what's coming through clearly there. Transactional Trump and Trump the admirer of the strong man. And then simultaneously what you've got going on is the Trump, the culture wars warrior, and what we saw in Munich.
Before you get onto that, I was just going to put a third one onto the Trump bit.
Right.
Because apart from those two, what you said is also Trump, the man who does not see any history contributing to a moment, to a current situation. So that, in Gaza, he's just saying, well, I wouldn't want to live here. The place is a wreck. And you go, how did it get like that? And it's the same with Ukraine. It's kind of, this is a real mess, lots of, and look, the Russians have lost an awful lot. I mean, there was an interesting discussion again. I can't remember quite what it could have been on Scotland Tonight, with one expert offering the view that what Trump would have to be offering the Russians is actually Russian security guarantees. This is the other expert disagreed with her completely, but said that they felt a lot of this started because the Russians perceived NATO to have essentially crossed the line and been expanding east into what was loosely understood to be sort of still the Soviet realm in a kind of vague way, and that they feel threatened. Now, I mean, this is extraordinary to have to look at it this way, but nonetheless, Trump's comments there, that's almost looking at, hey, you've got to sort of sympathize with the Russians. It's just like somebody who comes and takes a snapshot. There was nothing before it. There'll be nothing after it. Nobody contributed to it. Nobody started it. Nobody has got larger aims that they've said over and over in black and white that would lead you to, it's just this moment. Let's just deal with the two sides as if they're equal in moral and everything terms. And also nobody else gets into the conversation. So anyway, on with JD Vance, my dear.
No. Well, just again, the other thing is that I note that Steve Witkoff, the U.S. Middle East envoy, is there with Marco Rubio and Mike Waltz, and he's the genius behind the Gaza ceasefire. He's a massive real estate agent and a real estate magnate, and he's in there. And what was said by Sergei Lavrov was the Ukraine has the right to join the EU, but military alliances are explicitly different, and that Putin was open to meeting Zelensky if necessary, whilst undermining him, saying there should have been elections last year. So the question is legitimacy. But JD Vance, yes.
Yeah, but still, before JD Vance again.
Yes, okay.
Because the Estonian foreign minister was on. I was asked a very straightforward question. Estonia is a NATO member. It's also an EU member. And she was asked whether she felt the Americans essentially, the trigger, I can't remember which article it is, a hurt to one is a hurt to all and whatever, whether or not the Americans would come to Estonia's aid if Russia invaded Estonia. Estonia shares a border with Russia, and she just said no. So, I mean, that to me that's incredibly significant, because that is, I was there, made a film in Estonia with Charlie, whenever it was, a couple of years ago, and we were there for their Independence Day, 24th of February, and they actually had a sort of, not just a march past, but a kind of let's crush the beautiful ancient cobbles of Tallinn, tank roll through of NATO, because they are such NATO boys and girls. That's how keen they are on the whole thing, that it's enveloped right into their independence celebrations. So for the Estonians to just look you straight in the camera and say, we don't think NATO, the only thing that's important about NATO, that trigger of mutual support, okay, maybe the rest of Europe will come in, but as we're discovering, that ain't kind of, muscular enough at the moment. So already it feels like there's just a loss of faith in those countries that are bordering Russia. Right, JD Vance.
Yeah, but what you see, that, the JD Vance bit though, is that what we're seeing there is, we've always had this idealistic perspective on the transatlantic alliance, which has been swithering backwards and forwards. And I question whether the USA has ever perceived Europe or the UK as the primary allies. And that's the way it's developed since the 80s, and one doubts it. But JD Vance said that the true threat to Europe is not from Russia or China, but from its own retreat from some of its most fundamental values. Said that Europe's suppressing free speech, it's failing to halt illegal migration, running in fear from voters' true beliefs, and claiming that using words like misinformation and disinformation is a way to impose censorship, whilst coming out with the most outrageous statements, particularly in reference to in Scotland. I mean, the thought police were on patrol in Scotland, and you could be arrested for private prayer in your own home if you're involved in one of these cordons sanitaires around abortion clinics. I mean, it's absolutely outrageous, but it's the playing of this cultural values card that JD Vance has been sent out to do. And, is it, many people are asking, is this the end of, or is it the revolution of what the Transatlantic Alliance actually is? Is it the end of it? And how much is JD Vance playing to the tune being called by Donald Trump, or is he out there on his own? I genuinely think he's playing that alternative culture wars card, which plays into this living up to the strong men and this development of right-wing populism within Europe, because it's notable. He refused to meet the SPD leader Schulz, who is the current Chancellor of Germany, yet met the AfD leader Alice Liddell for 30 minutes. So, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'd have thought they're all, it sounds like a pretty synchronized set of swimming between Trump and Vance by the sound of it. But I mean, it must have been jaw dropping. I mean, I guess everybody, it's happened it was Friday, I think this happened. So, folk listening to this now will have had a wee time to digest it anyway. But it is completely gobsmacking, really, to have, just the values of what people thought was sort of Western civilization turned on their heads, with what we look at as kind of America's utterly incomprehensible kind of political aberration of the moment, suddenly being posited as the kind of new normal, which also represents the enduring values that we have sort of left behind. And suddenly we're the ones who are kind of, out of kilter and closing down debate and all this kind of just fucking madness. But still, as soon as somebody has kind of crossed that Leviathan, you've suddenly got this thing where people are on the back foot about an awful lot of things. And I notice, for example, strangely enough, Nigel Farage is at this Tory right-wing kind of Alliance for Responsible Citizenship ARC conference, which has been going on for the last few days. I mean, a serious bit of me just wants to ignore it because it's like, why do we give these guys any attention? But still, this is the one that Kemi Badenoch was speaking to yesterday and seemed to suggest that, the whole of Western civilization would be melting down if people didn't really support her and her outlooks. But he was actually having an interview with a guy, Peterson, who's a Canadian psychologist. And he was asking, quite a number of things. I mean, there's a lot of people waiting to see if he would ask Farage about Ukraine, because nobody's clear where Farage stands on that, actually. It seems that more Reform voters think Britain should just kind of cut and run, basically, than, anybody else. But anyway, Peterson was asking about lots of things, and he was asking about these questions, the sort of moral questions, the kind of stuff that JD Vance, he was the cat lady, quote. Yeah. I mean, those of us who have cats and are ladies, that's not easily forgotten. And Farage was actually dodging that kind of, the sort of moral question a lot, and actually said, as somebody who's been divorced a couple of times, I don't think I'm in any position to speak, which I'm sure must have been. So the Canadians and this Canadian-American axis is very tub-thumping about the primacy of the family, the sanctity of stuff, the appallingness of abortion. All that kind of stuff sits in that JD Vance and, by the looks of it, this chap Peterson's kind of axis, Whereas Farage is kind of sitting there, smoking, if he could possibly get away with it indoors, not really kind of thumping too much on that. But by gum, does he go on the question of its immigration?
Yeah.
So it's kind of, it moves around a bit, which will be the really key points, but what they're all sort of really hammering is this question of immigration. We know, you hardly need to hear what that is because it's, been thumped away so much. But what is interesting to me is that we'll put this link up, but basically there are projections produced by Eurostat which show the likely population of countries across Europe, including Britain, and breaking it down to Scotland, England, the four nations, the likely populations in the next 10, 15 years with immigration and without. And without, our population falls. I'm not looking at it quickly enough to be accurate on this, but by a pretty large percentage. And with migration, it starts to increase again. But what the agency is saying, if it looks at the whole of Europe, it's projecting a population decline of a third by the end of the century. Fair enough. You and I are probably not going to notice that, Pat.
No.
But the point is, without immigration, Europe is basically going nowhere. And just to throw this in, when you start to pick all this stuff about fertility rates and stuff up, the ONS here in Britain has reported in October just thereby that the fertility rate in England and Wales had dropped to the lowest on record, and that the average age of first-time mothers is at an all-time high. So the question is, I'm sure that Farage will sort of swing in and say, yeah, this is exactly what we need to, get families, women producing more than ever. And you kind of think, do you want to talk about provision? Do you want to talk about poverty? And, what kind of pressures it is that's making people feel that they don't want to bring children into this, or else can't afford to do it, or else feel so precarious because they're on a 6 month, if it's even that 1 month, just when you turn up contract. I mean, it beggars belief, really, that people can have this conversation without looking at the world that anybody would be bringing a child into. And that doesn't seem to be connected at all to these questions of migration. And just final thought, Kenny McCaskill wrote a very good piece in The National saying the worry for Scotland is not immigration, it's emigration. And it always has been. But we're losing people because we can't get a society here that is appealing enough for people to want to stay and have children in.
Yeah, and I'm just thinking of purely immigration on a Scotland basis. That Anna Starmer claimed he was in discussions about the provision of a separate Scottish visa, and that's been totally denied now by the UK Labour Party, saying no, Scotland is part of the UK and will be subjected to the same immigration rules as the rest of the UK. And it's by the way, that before I switch over here, this ARC group, I mean, there's some real beauties in there. Along with Jordan Peterson, you've got that Catherine Birbal Singh, Mike Johnson, the Republican Speaker of the House of Representatives, Douglas Ruddy Murray, Paul Marshall, head of and I cleaned that one up. The lead investor of GB News, owner of the Spectator, Vivek Ramaswamy, the Republican presidential candidate, who was the dual head of DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, more of which later. But Wes Streeting, right up there with Douglas Murray in my detest list, was on Good Morning Britain, where Richard Madeley, a well-known shoplifter, was, I'm saying nothing that isn't correct, he said that, what about the pressure on the NHS, said Richard Madeley, of legal and illegal migration? Is it the boats as well? It's immense pressure. And throughout this, Wes Streeting, who was on camera, nodding away furiously. And he said, no doubt net migration is placing real pressure on the NHS. Now, he did slip in the bit about we needed people here to actually through legal migration to work the NHS, but he was working on the basis that he was going to train people up, British workers for British jobs, in order to work in the NHS. And it is that whole worrying aspect of this, is that was a complete acceptance of the argument that immigration is the reason why you've got issues in the NHS. It's contributing to it. And that just compounded the most disgusting thing I've ever seen, I think, at Prime Minister's questions, was where Kemi Badenoch raised the issue of a Palestinian family using the provisions put in place to allow Ukrainian refugees from war to seek asylum in the UK. And she said, isn't this ridiculous that a court has said it can go to? To which Starmer said, the court is wrong. And what it identified clearly, Leslie, is that Starmer, I don't know if he has any ideological perspectives on it at all, is quite prepared to play what to me is the race card. Because what is the difference between Palestinian refugees from a war zone and Ukrainian refugees from a war zone?
Yeah, and actually, happily, in the last hour, the most senior judge in England and Wales has written to Keir Starmer saying she was deeply troubled about what he said. And you could see he might say, well, yeah, it was a scheme that was tailored for being about Ukraine, but you can quite understand why people from the appalling situation in Gaza would want to use it. And we're trying to think about how to do that, or something like that. If you wanted to just be, sit in the fence, Mr. kind of weedy guy. But to actually just kind of join in with Kemi Badenoch, I began to wonder if I was just in another universe listening to it, because it was almost like we've gone from everybody treating Gaza and the Palestinians as rightly being victims currently of just the most appalling genocide. And then suddenly, in 1 week, there seems to be kind of a consensus across those dispatch boxes that they're at it. Yeah. That they're sort of just conniving, trying to kind of jump in on who are proper, let's just face it, white people who are coming into a refugee scheme, which just happens to be on the cards and is problematic in its own right, actually. But still, just because it happens that Russia invaded freaking Ukraine before, the Hamas atrocity prompted what Israel has been doing since then. So this is just a sequencing issue, really, in the minds of most people listening. And our exposure to the hurt and horror of Gaza is more over the last year than it has been about anywhere else. And to hear that just being kicked into touch by Keir Starmer, again, like the technocrat he blinking is, that it was wrong. And he just left it there, that it was wrong. I mean, just with no sensitivity at all. It was absolutely appalling. Anyway, happily, Lady Chief Justice Baroness Carr, you don't get into these positions unless you've got about 7 bits before your name, has said she was deeply troubled to learn of the exchanges between Starmer and Badenoch. And she says both the question and the answer were unacceptable. Great. So somebody's, whacking him out of the head. Whether that makes any difference and what schemes are being devised now to help people in Gaza, that's obviously, that's just a smack out of the head. That's not solving the problem.
Oh, yeah, but again, it'll just be these lefty judges, enemies of the people, that are at it. Well, that will come back. But it is that whole pivot to the right that is taking place completely, Leslie, where they're so terrified about the potential, and the latest opinion polls have shown this. We're not immune to it up here when we look at the projections for the Holyrood elections. The predictions that are being made that could be a clean sweep down south of Reform, and they could be the largest political party by a mile at Westminster. So you've got that potential response, and Starmer and Badenoch have both engaged in it, which is the moving to the right on absolutely everything, particularly on immigration, and the use of that to actually, as you say, cover up the actual defects and faults that have grown up over the last 30, 40 years with the diminution of the welfare state, the diminution of that whole system, the post-war consensus about the creation of a fairer and more equal society.
But if nobody's going to come out fighting for that concept and even say things like the welfare state and basically argue for it and argue for the whole case for basically social democracy, if somebody's not going to go in and hold the line, then it's not going to be, it's not surprising that everything's shifting. And I see that, that every attempt by Labour to try and change, like, so today, for example, there's going to be, I don't know if it's just happened or not, but they're now talking about the Great British Railway that's being set up, which is obviously a distant cousin of, Great British Energy, and probably equally wafty. So the Transport Secretary for England, right, Heidi Alexander, is talking about fundamentally rewiring railways to escape decades of waste, inefficiency and fragmentation with the privatised railways introduced by Thatcher. So they're having a consultation, then they're going to set up Great British Railway. And you spot something there, folks. She's the Transport Secretary for England, and she's talking about Great British Railway. Yeah. So, I mean, I was actually going to, lose an hour at least of my life for no particular reason by phoning her office and asking what the plans are for Scotland. I mean, I'm sure the Welsh and Northern Irish would be pleased to know as well. And the big hoo-hoo of what is going to come from GBR is that they're going to sort of integrate. She says it's going to be a brand new public organisation bringing together for the first time in decades the management of trains together with the management of the tracks and infrastructure. Come to Scotland, Heidi, because that, despite all the blinking constraints of privatisation, the Scottish Railway is integrated. I'm not saying it's freaking all singing, all dancing, and there's lots of complaints about ScotRail and all the rest of it, but still, Network Rail and ScotRail are integrated in Scotland. And there's been a push out, there's been more electrification of the lines here than there has south of the border, and we've got a tenth of the population. So we've not been sitting on our thing, we have got something here that sort of is a template for working. If we didn't ever have to go through the charade of any kind of tenders again, it would probably help. But, it's this thing, and I'll bet you nobody will raise this when this is reported tonight. Watch this, and England, Britain will be used interchangeably. No mention will be made of the fact Scotland is kind of almost a pioneer for what they're talking about and has just managed to do that despite the privatisation. They could have done that themselves. And so there we are. I mean, it'll be a bit of a contest, because whilst they want to talk about their Great British Railway idea, the other slightly ickety sort of legacy of Thatcher is blinking water privatisation, with Thames Water now so running into the out of steam, and they're running out of cash. They're entering special administration. There's a hearing of some kind that started this morning, and if there isn't a solution found to that, then essentially the government will have to try and find a way to bring Thames Water into public ownership, which according to
hot off the press, Leslie, there's been a ruling.
Oh, right, yep.
Well, sorry, I knew you would. I just say apologies for interrupting there, but the High Court ruling is that they can get the $3 billion rescue package, the loan. Justice Leach said it was the only relevant alternative, because what you said, it was going to be temporary nationalisation. So it's in the public interest. And interestingly, Ofwat and the Environment Secretary, Labour Steve Reid, were not opposed. They were not opposed to the money being lent to them at, I think it's, 9.75 interest rate, because it was taken up by creditors who said that was an extortionate interest rate and they shouldn't be paying it, and that's what they objected to. So yes, the ruling has been made.
And I wonder in all of that, because my brain's not working fast enough, the same question will be with all of this, and it would have been if there was nationalisation. Are Scottish taxpayers with our water in public ownership paying for any of this?
Well, they'll only pay for it, I would think, if they actually had to be taken into temporary nationalisation. Suppose the agreement to the loan has meant that we don't. Yeah.
And I wonder, because I'd heard also that Thames Water, already the English are paying more for their water than we are, right? But Thames Water wanted to put their prices up by something like 53%.
Yep.
Are they still doing that?
Well, they've actually, Ofwat have said that they want to put in a 35%. It's still going to go up 35%, But Ofwat have said, no, your 53% is too much. And all they've done is just reverse the numbers around to make it 35%.
That does look like it.
Sorry, I mean, yeah. But anyway, and Thames Water are appealing the Ofwat decision. You know, I mean, this is a company. I mean, that when it was privatised, Thatcher wrote off all the debt, so Thames Water was debt free. It's an enormous company. It supplies over a quarter of England's water, and I mean, it is actually. I mean, it's leaked billions in dividends through all sorts of dodgy and shady ways that they've actually managed to disguise the money that's been going out. So when it looks, it's an incredibly flaky organisation. And Macquarie, the company who owned it prior to this lot, seemed to have been funneling money to all over the place, using, as I say, some very obscure methods, financial methods that actually leak money out of it. I mean, something like 2.8 billion has been paid out to shareholders in the past 11 years.
But this would not be, for example, just taking us on to this James Watt Brewdog idea of he will sit and be, the Elon Musk of Britain by sort of figuring out where waste exists and then slashing it, which seems to have got roundly, well, actually laughed at, to be honest.
Well, yeah, he deserves it. I mean, I must admit, I am a fan of their Indian Pale Ale, which is rather nice. But yeah, what James Watt of Brewdog, and I find this interesting because it was the punk approach to business, and they produced a book about this, and it's kind of like, I had my suspicions about the hippies in the 60s, and many of whom were, very entrepreneurial.
Come on, that's just because you were a mod.
A mod, exactly. Very soon. But again, is this whole punk ethos? And it turns out that James Watt, who claims to be agnostic politically, he said that the Tories were an absolute disaster for entrepreneurialism and business, but Rachel Reeves has come in and been worse. He says what he's going to do, he's going to submerge the UK government in the freedom of information requests, so you can delve deeply into how collectively our money is being wasted. Set up an anonymous hotline for public sector workers to report waste. He's going to issue a monthly report calling the government to account, and he says there's going to have to be an entrepreneurial approach, whatever the hell that means, taken to the public sector. And he's going to publish a table of waste. And he's basing this all on what's going on with the Department of Government Expenditure under Elon Musk. And as I say, the Vikas Ramaswamy that I mentioned, he dipped out pretty early from that. He was going to be the joint holder of that.
Oh, yes.
And what's funny about it is the Doge is coming under increasing pressure, not from the left in the United States of America, but bizarrely from the right, who are saying, if you're really wanting to take and axe the government expenditure, you're going to have to look at Medicare, you're going to have a look at Social Security, and you're going to have a look at defence spending. And Trump has specifically ruled out doing anything to do with Medicare, not tackling Social Security, and he's going to increase defence spending. And what the right has been turning around and saying is, in order to appeal to the culture warriors on the Conservatives, supporters of Trump, what Musk has been doing has been tackling fundamentally what you do. If you've not got you're running short of cash, you cancel your subscription to Netflix, and you don't deal with the big issues. You deal with the £8.95 to Netflix, your Amazon Prime subscription, your subscription to the National, whatever. You stop all these wee things, and that's what he's been doing.
Can I just say, you don't stop your subscription to the National. Come on, iPad, steady on.
That's it. Yeah, but what he's doing,
I take your point.
He's picking away at these tiny things, making these cultural points, whereas the big ticket issues are still there with the vast majority of government spending. But what he's doing is appealing to the culture warriors. So not only is James Watt barking up the wrong tree entirely in terms of what he thinks he's going to set up, which ain't going to happen, but also he's barking up the wrong tree if he thinks that Doge in the United States of America is anything to base his position on, because it ain't doing what he thinks it's doing. It's actually that deflection. Look at what we're doing here, and pretending to do things whilst actually doing it purely for political gain on the culture wars front.
Well, when you're talking about barking up the wrong tree, I thought, gosh, this is so well teed up, because do people remember, James? I must say, when I saw that headline in the National about an excellent piece Richard Murphy wrote about it's time to sort of ignore James Watt, I thought, but he's dead. I mean, he's long dead. You know what I mean?
God, yes.
Sort of steam engine boy and whatever,
Yeah.
you know. Anyway, so not that one. But yeah, Brewdog, there was a huge stushy actually that just last year about the lost forest that Brewdog were paid to plant. The very excellent Parks Watch Scotland, and we will put the link up for this, because if you're interested in the dodgy practices that go on in all our national parks, these are the guys who keep their eyes on everything. And they totally did the work on this, that not only was, that the 90% of the trees planted with Scottish forestry funding died, but then that meant that actually they were emitting carbon back into the atmosphere. So this was a real scam and very much barking up the wrong set of trees by Brewdog. But the thing that actually was brought up by Richard Murphy was really interesting, because this idea that James Watt has, that he's kind of going to just find out. Honestly, this is Monty Python again. There's a sketch where they're going to rid the world of all known diseases. And how are they going to do that? They're just going to become a doctor and jolly well tell people what to do. Okay,
yes.
fine.
Yeah.
So it's like that, right? So this is how we kind of get rid of all, pointless waste, according to me. I'm going to ask lots of freedom of information requests. So Richard comes in, and it's just, I can almost hear him speaking in this. He said the first thing about FOIs is that they have to be very, very, very specific. If they're not, they just don't get a reply. And that's absolutely true. Second, the government can refuse to reply to an FOI if they think it's time wasting or vexatious. And Richard says, I have no doubt that given the statement he's made, every single request he makes will be treated in that way. And the third one is, if one of his FOI requests did happen to slip through the net, there's a maximum expenditure the government can incur, and that is £600 per question. And he says, from my experience of using the system, I don't think James is going to find out a lot within that spending limit. So, he says, really, the system he's proposing to use will fail, and he should not have made himself look stupid by suggesting it. Now, thank you, Richard, right? Because, okay, there is just the larger point with all these guys of, the big picture stuff they're talking about. And then there's just kind of, when we're really getting down to it, my mind hadn't rested on that. Just if that's your mechanism. And as Richard says, his other suggestion is just as bizarre. He'll set up a hotline for public sector employees to report waste. He says, who, I wonder, will protect their privacy? No one, you can be sure, So it's kind of like none of this will work. And then the final question is, it's all so subjective, his idea of what's wasteful, given that he's already, basically killed a forest on a, mountainside. Who knows what he thinks and who cares? And that's not okay. So anyway, nice one to the prof.
Cracking. Yeah, because it's, and the thing about James Watt is great hero Elon Musk. What he doesn't define as waste is the billions he's been receiving for SpaceX and Tesla cars. So, let's just hang back from that though. What is waste? It's what other people spend on things I don't like. And
but then you've got to say, this is, I noticed today, the Sun has started to really go up for this. So they've got £8 billion worth of woke spending. So here we're going, Yeah. And the thing is, there'll always be examples of stuff that just sounds ridiculous. They've got a dancer showing off hip hop moves as part of a university study into TikTok videos. Yeah, another research on queer animals and using AI robots to make firms pro-trans. These are all heavily sub-down Sun headlines. But the thing about all of this, even if you find lots more examples of it, and you look at the whole nature of spending, this was the same as with the US aid. I've suddenly forgotten the right name of it. The Department of Aid that was basically already shut down in the States. Yeah. And there was examples of stuff that people were able to quote, which formed 0.6% of spending. Yes. Yeah. So it's the same thing again. Where's what the big spending is on things that are basically looking a bit beyond the curve? And are we just going to say, the future may be different from the past, but we don't care actually, because, we can make a little bit of a joke out of an extreme example of it. So, hey, that can go. Anyway, that's the world we're going to be in for the next wee while. So get your seatbelts on, folks.
And like a good comedian, I'll go back to something that you said earlier, and we'll reintroduce Trident. You want to cut waste, matey boy? Let's stop the nuclear deterrent. There you go. So
Yep.
that's that one there. But you can see what's going on though, Leslie, with it, because the Sun had the big headline from the Royal College of Emergency Physicians, I think it was. A Royal College of America. Anyway, I've mixed that name. Them ones, the emergency medical guys who turned around and said that there were 99 times more people having to wait over 12 hours now than there were a decade ago, etc., etc. And also, there's the big lead on the fact that Labour had managed to actually reduce the number of people waiting for appointments by 2 million in the time period. And again, I'm not the first to notice this, but the time period identified was one last year when the junior doctors were on strike. And so that's what we see there developing is the plan for the Holyrood elections in 2026, which the NHS is going to be a battleground for. And I think what the SNP has got to come out and do, is actually counter the arguments that are being made, because I think it's like 1 in 18 people are having to wait more than 12 hours in A&E up in Scotland, which is dreadful. I think it's 1 in 10 in England and 1 in 8 in Wales, but I didn't see that anywhere in the headline.
Yeah, and you want to have a look at Northern Ireland's just beyond the pale. But anyway, that's all true.
Yeah, and the other aspect of it as well is that if they wanted to look at something that's almost 100 times worse, what has happened in the last decade has been the increase in trolley weights in England, which went up from 150 to 150,000 per annum, where people are actually left waiting in areas. And there's the King's Trust has actually turned around and said there's a whole reason, and I won't go into them now, of complex reasons behind why waiting times in A&E appear to be going up. And bizarrely, one of them is medical advances. So many people who were actually being taken into hospital are now waiting in A&E because the medical treatments are available for them to be done in A&E. So there's that going on there. But that Holyrood election in 2026 and the NHS. But the other aspect of it is there's a whole lot of stories going about the selection procedure for candidates for the SNP in 2026.
But just before you jump onto that, because I mean, this is also true of Nigel Farage. Nobody swivels round and says to him, "So how are you going to do it?"
Yeah.
You know, in all of this stuff, and you get this so you can get the Tories, appalled at the length of waiting lists and so on. And actually, and let's say a special hello to all our Conservative listeners at this point.
Hi, Liz.
Hi, Liz. Anyway, the thing is, it's just not good enough. I mean, you can do this as the opposition because fair enough. I mean, it's up to the government to kind of come up with what they're doing. But as you move into election mode, and by gum, we're so close to being there, you have to put up some other ideas of how you're going to run the place. And the idea of Nigel Farage or any of these guys who clearly have no policy, even inclinations, about stuff, they're just able to stand on the moral high ground and just go, these people are useless, and you either have got an underlying feeling that you just don't like Keir Starmer and you just don't like Rachel Reeves, and actually there you are. The thing has been said, you identify with that feeling, and Bob's your uncle, and you don't need to know more. Just Brexit all over again. And we know that the bulk of English people who voted, to leave have regretted it. But here we are about to go through it again. It does take somebody coming up and actually, really questioning what other way. Here's the way that we want to work, and standing up for stuff. It just is proven that the happiest societies are ones that have got proper safety nets for everyone, that have everyone's systems, that take everyone with them, that care about what people's living standards are like, that even get higher levels of personal tax out of people because they're promising societies that actually work, where happiness means all sorts of things about growth and birth rates, all that stuff. And instead we've got this grim kind of mean society that wouldn't make anybody want to risk anything because it feels so venal. You wouldn't want to risk having children. You wouldn't want to risk having a business, having an idea, stepping out of line. all of it feels like you just got to be happy with the little bit you've got. And that doesn't promote, even we get into the discussion about growth, but that just doesn't promote anything. And somebody's got to stand up and say this kind of thing. I don't know who it'll be. Because it doesn't really seem to be, John Swinney gets very nervous about going beyond a certain point because it feels like somebody's going to turn around and say, well, what about growth in this budget then, John, because you've just cut it, which is a problem of being in government. The Greens, not sure where they are. It doesn't need to work its way right the way through to growth. But, somebody has got to stand up for the kind of society that's worth living in and for.
Yeah, well.
Might be David Tennant.
Well, yes, if we can get on to that, yes. I mean, we can move on to that right away. But again, just before we move on to the site of David Tennant, a Scottish institution and a Scottish national treasure. I'm going to put it that way.
Wearing a Scottish kilt as well, since that annoyed people about another kilt lately. But anyway.
But the thing about it is when you get back to Farage, and this has been the implicit and explicit acceptance by the Labour Party, as seen with Wes Streeting, it's migration is the issue. Lousy hospitals, too many migrants. No council housing. We're not building any. Too many migrants. Every school's failing. Too many migrants. Too many people. It's utter nonsense. But that ground has been ceded, and that's the way it will be fought at the next general election UK-wide, and it'll be interesting to see what happens up here when we do it. But David Tennant, I was kind of ambivalent when I saw I don't watch award shows because basically I find that how can you define what is a better film?
Mm-hmm.
How can you define that? How can you be the best director but the movie you made not have the best script and not be the best movie? And I'm thinking to myself, how can I get my head around that? And and Conclave won, but David, when I watched that YouTube thing when he was singing the Great Proclaimer's 500 Miles, which I have joined in innumerable occasions, and is great fun at weddings and things like that, there was just a bit of me went, I wasn't quite sure about it, to be honest, Leslie. I thought, was it a bit Scotch? You know what I mean? And he changed the words to be about the BAFTAs and introducing people. It was a bit showbizy for me. I know, good on him, but I just wish he'd sang the ruddy song.
Well, I don't know if you saw the whole. I didn't watch the BAFTAs either, but just looked at the wee YouTube. We'll put the link up to the whole YouTube thing because it's part of a sequence that begins from the beginning when he's in the makeup room and basically beginning to pap it about going out and having to hold the audience for this, and gets all sorts of visions in the mirror telling him basically he'll be shite, which concludes with Brian Cox saying to him, "You've just got to go out there and just take it to them," in his kind of most, stern succession-y kind of voice. And so that is what prompts Brian Cox starts singing 500 Miles. Now, let's just say Brian's not a singer, right? So that starts it off. And that's quite game, actually, because if you don't sing, it's quite something, because he wasn't really terribly on tune. But still, he kind of was going with it enough to kind of go, whatever, because he could see what the point was. And so then David Tennant picks it up, and he can sing, actually. So, and then he marches off down the corridor. I'm spoiling this for everybody. Just watch the blinking YouTube video, and then bursts into the auditorium. Now, I sort of thought dancer at that point because he was so giving it laldy and he'd pumped himself up for it. I just felt it went on a wee bit too long in the actual auditorium, because if you're actually watching the faces, everybody can do the sort of da because that's easy. But when you're watching the faces, hardly any of them seem to be singing the actual song. And then you're very aware of how Scottish this is, because if this was a Scottish audience, everybody would know all the verses, whereas these guys are going, there's something happening here, and then there's a da, we can do that bit, which is a bit Scotch. But still, it got him onto the stage. And if you've ever, you have had to pump it up for being on stage, my dear, having tread the boards repeatedly. It does take quite a lot of emotional energy to just take a whole bunch of non-Scots with you singing 500 Miles in a kilt, for a big do. So I still think fair play to David Tennant.
Yes, and I'm removing my Grinch hat and thinking, yes, I was being overly
Oh, you
critical.
you can keep the Grinch hat
No,
on,
no, no. I mean,
because I was borderline on it. I thought after about the fifth chorus, I thought, no, boy,
enough.
that was three too long. And
It's
actually, they found James McAvoy in the audience, and they'd
yes,
obviously cased the audience as well because some of it was so well placed, you know.
yeah,
But once you find James McAvoy and he can friggin' sing it, and you can see he's got the lines, that's the end, right? You don't need to go
yeah.
round other glamorous people that are too young for either of us to know who they are. Just leave it then, get to the stage, claim your moment, and get on with the awards that we would have switched off for.
Yeah, well,
In fact, we're ending this program exactly as we started it, didn't we? You know, talking to people who aren't listening about how to watch on YouTube, and now talking about a BAFTA award ceremony that we didn't watch.
Yeah, well, it's quite funny because just one of my favourite stories about Mike and Bernie Winters at the Glasgow Empire, when of course Mike, who was the straight guy, comes out in front of the curtain, does the chat. And suddenly Bernie Winters, hello, yeah, does his whole bit coming around the county and cleaning this up. And from the back of the audience, he says, oh God, there's 12 of them. And that's so there's a point at which you know when to stop. But
and for everybody who thinks straight in a different context to the one used there by Mr. Joyce, that was in the old straight and funny man sort of context, as opposed to anything else, I think.
yes, oh yeah, that's
Yes.
yes, the straight guy and the stooge. So yes, and just that before we go in, and I use the word national treasure there, and maybe I'm not going to go over the top. I'd just like to say best wishes to Janice Forsyth, who Leslie knows well, and I know through her work, who has come out and said that she's in the early stages of early onset Alzheimer's. And that's something that's affected my family. So my heart goes out to Janice, and God bless her.
Absolutely. I mean, there's not many things that just stop you in your tracks. When I saw that, I've had so many texts in from other people who know Janice. And you see, this is it. People are using the past tense. She's there, and she might be listening to this. She's not that different today than she was yesterday. And okay, so she's had a diagnosis that is difficult. But knowing her and having worked with her, she is the cheeriest woman, you know, utterly brilliant broadcaster, because so much of broadcasting is not just about who you can whack her the head with stuff in aggressive kind of interviews. That's one Paxman-like way of doing it. But Janice and it was she wasn't working in news and current affairs, but in the cultural sphere, she was so warm. She brought the most out of everybody she interviewed and made it look easy, you know, which is always the mark of an incredible professional. So I hope that now that she's decided to stand back from broadcasting, and she was also behind the big podcast kind of,
Talk
brand.
Media.
Yeah. But if she's standing back from that, there's a whole blooming world out there which she now has time to explore. So I just think with everybody, she is the marvelous Janice Forsyth. She continues to be. She always has been. She always will.
And on that note, we'll see you next week, chums.